Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is October 12th, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update, and we are going to be asking ourselves just what is Russia's strategy, how is Belarus involved, and how much longer can they keep up these missile strikes on Ukraine? We're going to get into all of it right now. Okay, so first and foremost, let's take a look at the tactical map. There are very few changes. While this may indicate that Ukrainian forces are regrouping, or there may actually have been some command and control disruptions caused by, these missile strikes, we can also see that Russia also is unable to achieve any advances. So I think it's equally possible that Russian forces are attempting to use these heavy cruise missile strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure, possibly as cover in an effort to disrupt, hoping that these missile strikes are disrupting Ukrainian logistics and command and control, and are using this opportunity to try to stage a counteroffensive. But for an army that is unable to function on the defense, which is a very, very, very easy, comparably easy tactical mission, going on offense, especially with limited planning, is very, very hard to do. Right. And when you're talking about newly mobilized troops, you have to think the defense for the average trooper is going to be dig a hole, sit in it, and shoot the enemy if they come from a certain direction. These are things that even with very limited training, you can perform this sort of function. However, if you're talking about going on the offensive, you have to understand your role, the units around you. You have to be able to advance using individual movement techniques, engage targets, establish a sector of fire. It's a lot more complicated, and a lot more has to happen on the fly, right? I think we're seeing the fact that Russia hasn't really made advances as an indicator that no amount of high-tech cruise missile strikes are going to offset the fact that the average Russian infantryman probably just isn't up to the task right now of engaging in offensive operations. Again, there may not be an accompanying offensive because these cruise missiles aren't actually striking Ukrainian positions. If my goal was to break Ukrainian lines, I would use my precision-guided weapons to attack those lines. The fact that they're not says that this is actually probably a political maneuver by Putin to appease domestic Russian politics. And we'll break down why in just a second. So when we look over to the Institute for the Study of War, who's really a good source for the sort of the inner workings of the Kremlin, we see that, in fact, Russia has kept up its missile strikes, launching 30 Kh-101 and Kh-55 cruise missiles from their strategic bombers, and also used more Iranian-made Shahed-136 drones to strike Ukrainian infrastructure targets. But Ukrainian General Staff is reporting that about 2/3 of those cruise missiles were shot down and 11 unmanned aerial vehicles were destroyed. This is what I would consider a good success rate. It's not clear on how many of these drones Russia has received and how fast they can expend them, but this seems like a significant portion, again, of Russian combat power, even though the initial volley was 80 cruise missiles. Now we're down to 21. I expect that they can't keep up volleys of this nature for very long. Now, what's interesting is that this strike, even though it hasn't been accompanied really by the sort of highly robust attack that common sense and good military tactics says should be synchronized with this preparatory fires, we can see from here this may just be the Russian Ministry of Defense trying to claw back its reputation. First, they've appointed as the commander of Russian armed forces in Ukraine, Sergei Sorovkin, Sorovivkin, and he was also the commander of Russian armed forces in Syria for a time, and some Russian commentators are arguing that this is actually Russia's military using tactics that would be very familiar that were used in Syria, a Syrianization of the war. This is almost certainly a mischaracterization. The war in Syria was vastly different. Russia barely had to provide ground forces for that conflict, and were instead supporting a local national force in the form of the Assad regime that was already committed, already at least an effective fighting force on the ground, able to take, seize, and hold territory. This is not that conflict, right? Russia's biggest weak spot is not their enablers, though their enablers have become increasingly ineffective, but it's the actual lack of effective ground forces in the fight. And when you can see here, you realize that that while Ukraine believes that throwing rockets at civilian infrastructure is consistent with Sotovivkin's tactics in Syria, ISW points out that almost every Russian commander has been engaged in some level of command operations in Syria. Also, they point out that it seems likely that these missile volleys were planned prior to the appointment of this general, at least the announcing of his appointment. But it's not clear that certainly this necessarily has his hallmark, his stamp on it. They argue instead this is a standard part of the Russian way of war, and this makes sense, right? These are certainly increased in scale, but in terms of character, they aren't really that different. Missile strikes on Kiev were a defining thing early in the conflict. We also saw missile strikes in Lviv and other Ukrainian backfield infrastructure, often civilian infrastructure. The biggest thing, then they point out that this was probably to rehabilitate perception of the Russian Ministry of Defense. We've discussed that the Ministry of Defense has sort of been on the outs, right? The defeats in Lyman, the loss in the breaking of the lines in Kherson has really made the Ministry of Defense look very bad and very ineffective especially among Russian pro-ultranationalist mill bloggers, right? It's sort of the voice of the Russian ultranationalist wing. And so in order to sort of maintain the perception that they are effective, they have switched out to a new general and done so, or at least announced this occurrence, concurrent with major strikes against Ukrainian civilian targets. And while this militarily is a really stupid call, the mill bloggers are really loving it. They think it's great. They think Sorovkin is a hero. And this is, again, a good illustration of why the general public really should not be the ones dictating military policy. But if you're wondering why Russia's so ineffective in this war, this is just one more reason to add to your list. It's simply preposterous that mill bloggers, right, oftentimes people who are just sort of pro-nationalist talking heads, are going to sit there and weigh in on large-scale military and strategic tactical decision-making. Even as, I have a lot of experience in this area, right? I have not only served as a platoon leader in Afghanistan, right, completed the U.S. military's captain's career course and police mentorship training and a bunch of other military training. I also have a master's degree in strategic studies, right, the national security studies from Johns Hopkins. So I realize that there's so much information I'm not party to because I'm an open source analyst, right? I don't have good information on the disposition and composition of Russian forces and Ukrainian forces and the realities on the ground and routes and route accessibility. There's so much information that's behind the veil of military operations that, I make sort of broad suggestions and do some level of analysis. But the idea that a random Russian mill blogger should be the ones dictating strategic policy, should be the ones dictating individual operational and tactical decisions on behalf of these commanders is utterly ridiculous. This is the equivalent of allowing a talking head from your news station in the U.S. To guide military policy in a conflict. It's the tail wagging the dog, and it's again a sign that Russia has suffered so many defeats that you're now not really fighting the war. You're posturing and attempting to cater to different people, running a war by committee. There's a reason why military commanders are the only ones who have authority to give orders, and that's because militaries don't get to run on a vote. Okay, moving on to Belarus, right? Is Belarus going to enter the war? Well, Belarus is about as pro-Putin and pro-Russian as a country can be without being annexed by Russia. And even they are really, really reluctant. They're not going to commit their armed forces to this fight, but that doesn't mean that they haven't been providing some support. Belarusian bases have been staging areas for Russian attacks, and now it looks like Belarusian military reserves are actually just getting cleared out by the Russian army. While this is useful, certainly we've seen some videos of Russian mobilized troops with a fraction of the necessary equipment, weapons and body armor, etc. By stealing Belarusians' military gear, it definitely precludes the Belarusian military from actually intervening, right? You can't really mobilize a military if you've taken all of their weapons. At that point, they're not a military, they're just guys in uniforms. But it's worth noting that I think Putin would probably have preferred to have seen the actual trained and effective Belarusian military get into the fight. And the fact that they haven't is an indicator to me that Belarus has refused, probably on several occasions, to mobilize their own military, and is only now, in Russia's absolute desperation, offering to provide some level of material support. But again, this is Belarus, and while their material and equipment might help for a little while, it's not the same thing as getting support from someone who can actually manufacture their own military equipment, like China or India or another country that's sort of loosely supportive of Russia. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for today. Of course, if you want to see the uncensored combat video breakdowns that I cannot post to YouTube definitely has been cracking down on those. Become a member of the Patreon. And of course, if you also want to support the channel, check out our sponsor, Ground.News. They let you see the way the same story is covered across the political spectrum. Absolutely essential in this conflict. Link to both are in the description. I'll see you guys tomorrow.